Hunting made us human. Hunting made us human. We are the humans we are today because we have consumed red meat and organs preferentially for the last 2 million years. It's really an unarguable fact that is corroborated by all sorts of evidence, stable isotopes from teeth and bones. And we have hunted animals at the exclusion of other foods as the majority of our diet for the last 2 million years. Eating plants didn't make us big-brained. Eating animals made us big-brained. And then you see that reflected in nutrients as well. There are many nutrients found in red meat and organs, like liver and heart, that are not found in plants. There are things like creatine, choline, carnosine, carnitine, anserine, taurine, B12, the full spectrum of K2 menaquinones. The list goes on and on. But the reverse is not true. There are no nutrients in plants that are not found in animal foods. You can get every single thing you need to be an optimal human by eating entirely animals. Now, I'm not saying that people need to eat entirely animals. My goal is not to convince everyone to give up eating plants. My goal with the book and with the messaging and what we do at Heart and Soil is really threefold. To help people understand, first and foremost, kind of like we've been talking about, that red meat and organs are the centerpiece of the human diet. They've been that way for millions of years, and they're integral to optimal human health. To ignore them is to ignore our ancestry. And to ignore them really forsakes a lot of unique nutrients that you cannot get anywhere else. And they've been incorrectly vilified for the last 70 years based on bad studies that are observational. Number two, that plants exist on a toxicity spectrum, and we can get into this if you want, that plants are rooted in the ground. They have toxins. They don't want to get eaten, and they're going to defend themselves somehow. And for a lot of people who are struggling, elimination of the most toxic plants or all the plants can be a huge step in the right direction if they include animal organs and meat, eat nose to tail, in their diet. The last piece of the equation is that processed vegetable oils, which came into our diet with the vilification of animal foods, are really the bane of our existence, and I think the major driver of chronic metabolic disease in this country. But so in the book, you'll see I've included this spectrum of plant toxicity, and it's not so much about getting people to just eat animal meat all day. It's helping them understand some plants are more toxic, less toxic, and kind of branch from there and think and eat more like our ancestors did. I don't think our ancestors ate no plants. I don't think they prioritized plants. I think they used plants as fallback foods, as survival foods, and they understood which parts of plants and which plants were more and less toxic. And when they had to eat toxic parts of plants, they did a lot of things like fermentation to detoxify them. So I just dropped a lot on you. I'll let you take it from there.
No, you went right into what I was going to go to next, and that was on page 34. A case of mistaken identity. And I love how you lead into this where you say, kale doesn't love you back. Now I do. I love kale. I just enjoy it. I enjoy it with my other stuff. Kale doesn't love you. Broccoli's just not that into you. Spinach isn't a real friend. And you talk about like these bad relationships. And I do want you to talk more about that because I feel like there is, I feel like the whole, I feel like there's a growing greater acceptance for in terms of like things like keto and including more meats and organ meats into the human diet. I think there's certainly, I'm seeing a greater interest and people are starting to ask questions, and to me that's always a good thing. If people are asking questions, to understand more, there's it's learning, and that can only help. But there's this huge foundation in vegetables, and from there I want you to go into that because a lot of people use that like fiber, and you say how like the fiber is a myth. So I want you to address the bad relationship with vegetables and tie that into how fiber is a myth and explain to our listeners, okay, if my relationship with vegetables maybe isn't the best thing for me, where do I get my fiber? Because don't I need fiber to be healthy and to lose weight? Yeah, you don't. I mean, the Cliff Notes answer is you don't need fiber to be healthy or lose weight. And we can talk about that. And yes,
there's a whole chapter in the book about fiber. Yes. So when I come to fiber, I'll tell you a story about my friend who was in the Rangers in the Army. But if you think about it from the perspective of kale or spinach or a plant, it makes a lot more sense. So we might say, I hear this people all the time, but I love kale. And I say, well, kale doesn't love you back. Like kale is a plant that's a brassica. It's a leaf that you're eating of a plant. And does that plant want you eating its leaf? No. If you eat enough of those leaves, you will kill the plant. If you eat the seeds, you're going to kill the plant. And if you eat the roots, you're going to kill the plant. And so What's to stop all the animals on the planet from just going to town on kale? If everybody loves kale, you can just eat kale. It's sort of like all plants are edible. Everything is good for you. And really the way that humans can be healthy is just by eating plants all day. It doesn't work like that. Plants are rooted in the ground. They've had a coevolution with animals for the last 450 million years. And out of necessity, they've had to evolve toxins. We don't really know about these. We're never told about toxins in kale, but there are many. And there are many toxins in spinach. There are many toxins in all kinds of plant foods that we're never told about because nobody tells us about them. Because kale has a really good publicist. And yeah. And so, in the case of kale, you have a plant leaf from a plant that's rooted in the ground. And what is kale doing to defend itself? Well, it has a whole series of booby traps. It starts with molecules called glucosinolates, which which are then, made into isothiocyanates. So how are glucosinolates made into isothiocyanates? Well, glucosinolates combine with an enzyme called myrosinase when the plant is chewed. So many people who like kale or broccoli that are in the same family, they're essentially the exact same plant, have heard of this molecule called sulforaphane. And they think, oh, sulforaphane is good for me. And so the question that I ask them is, how much sulforaphane is in a broccoli plant or a kale leaf? Do you have any idea?
I don't.
None. There's none. There's no sulforaphane in broccoli or kale until you chew it. Because it's a booby trap. Because sulforaphane is a pro-oxidant. And then you get into organic chemistry and you have to talk about what a pro-oxidant or an antioxidant is. But a pro-oxidant is a reactive molecule that goes into the body or into an environmental system and takes electrons from other molecules. Oxidation and reduction are the movement of electrons, the gain and loss of electrons. And so sulforaphane, we've been told, is an antioxidant. That's just false. No organic chemist, no general chemist would get out of the first year of college chemistry if they said sulforaphane was an antioxidant. Sulforaphane is not an antioxidant. It's a pro-oxidant. You're moving the electron in the wrong direction if you think it's an antioxidant. So we've been told sulforaphane is an antioxidant. That's the lie. And there's no sulforaphane in broccoli until you chew it because sulforaphane is a defense chemical. Because sulforaphane is a pro-oxidant and its job is to run around stealing electrons from other molecules, its job is to oxidize molecules. Sulforaphane's job is to create free radicals. And now I'm talking about things that people are familiar with and they understand they're not good. Sulforaphane's job is to create free radicals, and it does. Sulforaphane creates free radicals in our body. It creates lipid peroxides, it creates free radicals, it creates damaged proteins, it does all sorts of bad things in our body. But it does that as a booby trap. It's a precursor form. It's a glucosinolate called glucoraphanin, and then when you chew it, or an animal chews it, or an insect chews it, myrosinase combines with glucoraphanin and makes sulforaphane. In a lot of these plants, this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the isothiocyanates. There's goitrin, there's allyl isothiocyanate. There's hundreds of chemicals in cabbage and kale and broccoli that serve the same roles. There's tons of isothiocyanates out there. Many of them are even more toxic to our body systemically than sulforaphane. So the confusion continues to arise because sulforaphane comes into the human body, and because it's a pro-oxidant, it triggers an antioxidant response pathway in the human body called the NRF2 system. And a lot of things that we experience trigger the NRF2 system. There's a protein called KEAP1, KEAP1, which holds onto NRF2 in the cytoplasm. And when there's oxidative stress, when there are more free radicals, NRF2 dissociates, goes to the nucleus, and turns on genes involved in the antioxidant response. Sulforaphane turns on our antioxidant response. Well, you know what else turns on our antioxidant response? Mercury, lead, cigarette smoke, alcohol, lots of things cause oxidation. And even things like exercise or fasting or heat or cold stress can turn on those oxidative mechanisms. So we see things that we think of as both good and bad can do it. And this is in the book where I differentiate environmental hormesis from molecular hormesis, because I think everyone gets confused here and people don't understand the difference. And it's just something that's been, I think, incorrectly communicated. It's been a myopic perspective to think of these molecules as hormetics. Because if you listen to Rhonda Patrick or somebody else, they'll say, oh, sulforaphane is a hormetic. It's good for you. A little bit of a poison is good for you. And I disagree with that strongly. I think we've got it all wrong. And I'll tell you why. So sulforaphane comes into the human body. It triggers NRF2, which turns on the antioxidant response system. You get more glutathione. You get more superoxide dismutase. And if you only look at the response of the antioxidant system in your body to sulforaphane, you might see a short-term bump in antioxidants, in endogenous antioxidants, not exogenous, endogenous. We have antioxidants in our body, glutathione, superoxide dismutase. That's what we use. Sulforaphane does not act as an antioxidant in the human body, nor does any molecule from plants. Plants do not play a unique role in human biochemistry. They are not vitamins. These molecules are not vitamins. They are not minerals. They are just influencing our biochemistry, but they do not have unique roles. So sulforaphane comes in, it can trigger more glutathione, which in the short term can make it look like you're doing better, but it forgets the other side effects, and it's a redundant effect. So no one talks about the side effects of sulforaphane, but there are many. The isothiocyanates are a family of compounds that are well studied and well known to affect iodine absorption at the level of the thyroid.
Right. Yeah.
Have you ever seen these people in Africa with the really big necks, or South America? That's a goiter.
Yeah.
That's a goiter. It's called endemic goiter. These compounds are called goitrogens. They're goitrogens because they prevent the proper absorption of iodine. So if you are low on iodine or not getting enough iodine, or you're eating a low iodine diet, or you're eating a diet that's very high in goitrogenic foods, which are clearly not the ideal foods for humans, you can get iodine deficient.
In your opinion, do you think, and this could be kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg, I don't know, but do you think we are living in a time where we're either starting to understand nutrition better, learn more about nutrition and food, or we're actually learning more about and understanding the human body better?
Oh, it's both. I mean, when was DNA discovered? When was the double helix of DNA discovered? 100 years ago, 1930s, maybe Watson and Crick. I got to get that exact date. But 100 years ago, we didn't even know what DNA was, or that it was a double helix. So in the last 100 years, we've learned many things about nutrition and different nutrients, and we're just now beginning to understand nutrients in both plant and animal foods. So we're learning more. We're learning more about human biology. I mean, when was the Krebs cycle figured out? When was the electron transport chain understood? It's all happened within the last 100 or so years, the X-ray crystallography of the proteins in the electron transport chain. So we're learning a massive amount and starting to put the pieces together. But I do think we're also beginning to understand more about evolution and where we've come from, and more anthropology, and everything's advancing. I mean, it's interesting to me. I think 200 to 300 years ago, people just did what was easy. They did what was natural, which was to eat animal foods and animal fats.
Yeah.
And it wasn't even a question. We just did it normally. I mean, a couple of thousand years ago, if you were still in a hunter-gatherer tribe, you just hunted animals and used plants as survival food. So we're sort of, we knew how to do it, and then we forgot about it when we started cultivating seeds and becoming farmers and making more and more processed foods, processed sugars, or processed oils, vegetable oils, with the inclusion of cottonseed oil or Crisco vegetable oil in 1911. So we sort of knew it, we forgot it, and now we're having to rediscover or remember things that we used to know as the science starts to tell us the story once again. It's a point of remembering and reawakening, but in order to, that implies that at some point we sort of fell asleep, which I think we did. It's clear. I mean, we're a very unhealthy population now. It's very clear that we went off the rails.
Right. Now in chapter 2, I got my little markers here. I'm not going to read the whole thing out, but I do want you to talk a little bit more about this, because I found this to be like it's early on in the book, and it's a big statement. And I think a lot of people are, in their own minds kind of wondering this as well, because you just said we're an unhealthy population. I mean, obesity rates rise, mental health.
Skyrocketing,
becoming a huge issue. And
skyrocketing.
You say, and you say that your point with this book is not to say that our societal progression away from our previous days as hunter-gatherers has been all bad, but that while there have been some benefits gained along the journey, there's been many negative things like rampant chronic disease and other things, and that current estimates indicate 80% of the Western population has some form of metabolic disease, prediabetes, and insulin resistance. Talk about that, because I don't know how many people are really aware of that statistic, but I'm certain that even those that really aren't, immersed in the science, or but I think really at the end of the day, most of us want to be healthy and well, and we're doing the best with what we know. But to read something like that, it might make somebody sit back and go, okay, well, why is this? Because we live in a time where, like, science, technology, like the resources and things that we have available to us, things should be getting better. So then why aren't they?
Great question. That's to me the most interesting question we can ask. And it's not even really debatable. This is just fact. You can look at our lifespan extending, but we're living longer, weaker, more decrepit lives. We're not leading better lives. So people might say, well, we live longer. Well, that's debatable as well. And we can get into hunter-gatherer tribes and this concept of squaring of the morbidity curve, and the fact that if you look at indigenous hunter-gatherers, if they escape infant mortality or childhood mortality, they live just the same amount of time as us, and they're much more vital longer into their life, and they don't have chronic disease. But the statistic that you mentioned there, that 88% of our population has at least some indicator of metabolic dishealth or unhealth, is just a striking statistic. That is quoted from a paper that's referenced in the book, and it has to do with one of the 5 criteria for metabolic syndrome, which are HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, waist circumference, hip to waist circumference, abdominal obesity, these type of things. I think there's a large amount of people that have improper function of their thyroid at subclinical levels, even in the US, from eating lots of these foods because they're not getting enough iodine to their thyroid. It's grossly evident pathologically in these huge goiters, these huge necks. What do people in South America and Africa eat? They eat a lot of cassava. Cassava is another goitrogen which contains isothiocyanates, and they have a low iodine diet. Where do we get iodine? We get iodine from animal foods, things like eggs, or from fish or seafood, or certain organs of animals. So we see here that plants are fighting against us. If we just ate lots of kale and you don't get enough animal foods, you're going to get iodine deficient. You're going to get a goiter. You're going to get thyroid disease. You're not going to be able to reproduce, and your species is going to be dead. So plants are clearly not interested in you eating them. Kale doesn't want you to eat it. And so then the response is, okay, I get it, but isn't the risk worth the benefit? Isn't the hormesis from sulforaphane worth the benefit? And I say, no, absolutely not, because the benefit is redundant. There are so many ways we can employ what I call environmental hormesis to benefit us, and we don't need molecular hormesis. Invariably, this was one of the crazy things that I discovered as I was writing the book. When we try and use plant molecules as hormetics, this is molecular hormesis, it fails because they always have side effects. They're always going to go somewhere else in the body and do something wrong because they're not part of our operating system. I talk about this operating systems concept in the book as well. And you can see this with all sorts of molecules: resveratrol, curcumin, sulforaphane. I give lots of examples. Isoflavones, genistein, all sorts of molecules in the body that come from plants, quercetin. You see the same thing. You see side effects, side effects, side effects. We're never told about the side effects. We're only told about the, quote, benefits. But the benefits invariably are redundant. They're things that we can attain by just living well. So you can turn on more glutathione just by doing heat stress and cold stress. If you just jump in a cold pool, like the cold water swimmers in Berlin that I mentioned in the book, you can increase your glutathione. You can create oxidative stress and bump your glutathione by just living well. You don't need sulforaphane to get more glutathione or to get optimal amounts of glutathione. That's never been shown. In fact, the opposite has been shown repeatedly. When people who are living reasonable lives eliminate all fruits and vegetables from their diet, and a vegetable less fruit and vegetable less diet is compared to a diet that has fruit and vegetables, researchers over the course of 4, 8, 10, 12 weeks don't see an improvement. They don't see an improvement. They don't see lower levels of inflammation. They don't see lower levels of DNA damage. They don't see any differences between those two groups. It's very hard, I think, to make the case that vegetables have a clear benefit in humans from an oxidative stress, from a DNA damage perspective. There are multiple interventional studies that I talk about in the book that clearly demonstrate that the complete removal of fruits and vegetables does nothing, and the inclusion of fruits and vegetables does nothing. There's even one study in the book where the removal of fruits and vegetables led to better outcomes: lower levels of oxidative stress, lower levels of DNA damage, lower levels of inflammation. So to make the case to say fruit and vegetables are good for us is like, well, I'm not sure that's entirely supported by the literature. I think that we can tolerate them, that we have the ability to detoxify some of these things in our body. That's what our phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification systems are for in the liver. But plants are not the ideal food for humans. And kale is a plant that lives in the ground. It doesn't want you eating its leaves. It doesn't love you back. You might be able to detoxify that to a point, but I don't think it's giving you anything unique. You don't need the sulforaphane in kale to get extra glutathione. You have plenty of glutathione if you're exercising, if you're in the sun, if you're sauna, if you're cold plunging, if you're living the life that any normal human on this planet should be living, that most of your listeners are already doing. You don't need that. And then you avoid the side effects. Why take a medicine, quote unquote, why take a molecule from a plant for a redundant benefit when you also get all these negative side effects with it? So that's, I think, where people have been misled. And if you look at the plant molecules time and time again, you see the same thing over and over. There's no net benefit to sulforaphane. It's a net negative. Spinach is the same way. Spinach is full of oxalates. The leafy greens are all full of this stuff. So, and we see this with many molecules. The same is true with resveratrol. You can activate the sirtuins just by fasting. Just by doing ketosis, you can activate your sirtuin genes. You don't need resveratrol. Resveratrol is a phytoalexin. It's a plant defense chemical produced in the skin of grapes and peanuts when they're attacked by the botrytis fungus. It also happens to look a lot like 17-beta estradiol in humans and trigger the estrogen receptor, which is what we call a xenoestrogen, much like BPA or phthalates or parabens. Both men and women don't want to be over-triggering the 17-beta estradiol receptor. You don't want xenoestrogens in your body. We're avoiding plastics like the plague today, and we're all worried about microplastics, and then we're going and we're taking resveratrol pills, which do very similar things in our physiology. Resveratrol has been shown to lower levels of androgen precursors in the human body. So these molecules are not good for humans. It's a redundant benefit with a net negative side effect that we're never told about. The same is true with curcumin. The same is true over and over. So these magical plant molecules are nothing magical at all. They're just bad for us. And your body wants to detoxify them. Your body wants to get rid of them. If your ancestors were forced to eat kale, they were in dire straits. And that's probably why sauerkraut is a thing. Because if you ferment the cabbage, which is in the same family as kale, you degrade, you destroy many of those glucosinolates so they don't turn into sulforaphane. So if you ferment the plants, you can make them less toxic. But you're just basically eating it for calories to survive. It's clearly not the ideal food. If a food is trying that hard to kill you or that hard to prevent you from having babies, that food is not good for you. You can eat it in a pinch, and we probably did when our hunts were not successful. But why not just get more of the optimal food for humans?